Welcome to part 2 of my video on Elizabeth Anderson's objections to luck egalitarianism. So previously, we discussed issue of luck egalitarianism and how it faces the problem of choice, which Elizabeth Anderson argues gives rise to certain absurd and counterintuitive problems. And it seems to leave the imprudent in a pretty bad way without actually providing them with the kind of treatment which we seem to take to be constitutive of an egalitarian society, meaning that it's treatment that we should accord to everyone. So one of the solutions that some egalitarians propose is this idea of mandatory insurance. As we can see in Arneson, he mentions this as a possible solution, as mentioned in the previous video. Now, of course, it seems that if someone does something imprudent and we want them to avoid a very bad fate, that seems to be obviously good, at least on one dimension. But the problem, Elizabeth Anderson argues, is that luck egalitarians can only justify this kind of behavior on paternalistic grounds. Meaning that this idea is that it's only because these people are believed to make some kind of bad decisions, right? That's why it's paternalistic. That we can justify having mandatory insurance if, for example, if people have some kind of health issues, or if they, for one reason or another, become disabled or handicapped, or if they have caregiver subsidies, as we discussed previously. This is according to some egalitarians, this idea of making an expensive choice. Now, then you might ask, well, why is basing these kinds of policies on paternalistic reasons a problem? Right? So the argument that Anderson wants to make is that egalitarianism wants to show people equal concern and respect. And the idea is that paternalistic reasons don't show respect, neither do they show concern. We'll get to concern later on. An argument here is something like that, right? Which is that mandatory social insurance schemes are insulting. Right, so here's the quote from Anderson from Fu: "Luck egalitarians are effectively telling citizens that they are too stupid to run their lives, so Big Brother will have to tell them what to do. It is hard to see how citizens could be expected to accept such reasoning and still retain their self-respect." And I think that for those of us who are sort of familiar with the Singaporean system and the way that Singapore runs its economy and social policy, this shouldn't be too unfamiliar. So here's the idea of mandatory social insurance is in a sort of way that kind of paternalistic policy can also be seen, right, arguably in the Central Provident Fund in Singapore, right? So there's this idea that there is forced savings, right? So there's this idea that people will not be sort of like forced, right, through certain paternalistic policies, and there is also constraints on the way that people can actually use that savings, right? Now, of course, as you can see from the response from Lee Hsien Loong here, is that this idea that well, every society has to have some kind of arrangement, and the CPF is a way of for Singapore making those kinds of arrangements. But the thought would be that, yes, while that might be true, right, the luck egalitarian idea, right, that we allow people to make choice, but in order to prevent the imprudent from suffering unnecessarily, we have to have paternalistic policies. And the idea would be then that something like the CPF, where you have forced savings, is a way of helping the imprudent, but that's actually a way of actually also insulting them, right? Because it's saying that, well, you people cannot make good decisions, so we have to force you to save in order for you to be to retain, right, a certain level, basic level of needs. And we can see this again clearly here in this clip from Mothership, where they said Singaporeans feel that the autonomy to manage their money has been taken away, right? So this idea that the ability to do what you want with your money has been sort of taken away. And the justification here is that in order for you not to be imprudent, we have to have this kind of forced savings policy. Now, the luck egalitarian has sort of two ways of replying to this argument that such policies might be insulting, right? The first is that they say, well, look, it doesn't, as kind of in the spirit of what Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong is saying, right? Which is that every society would like to avoid bad outcomes, right? Even for the imprudent, right? So even if it is in some way potentially insulting, it should be something which we should have good reason to implement. And then the idea is that another possible argument is that, well, self-respect is still compatible with some kind of paternalism, right? So one example that's often given is this idea of seatbelts, right? That asking people to wear a seatbelt does not take away their autonomy. That would seem ridiculous, right? But Anderson argues that, well, this might seem correct, right? But while she agrees with the spirit of the argument, this reply also raises sort of two criteria for egalitarian theory, she argues. So first of all, there's a need to distinguish between goods that the society should guarantee for each and every individual, and goods that you cannot lose claims to, right? And goods that you may lose, right, without claiming compensation from others, right? And so here it is not about, as the welfarists or the resources might say, defining a minimum level of welfare or resources. And the example she gives here is, so imagine someone who is a negligent driver, and as a result of their negligent driving, their child passes away, right? So this person will be very sad. Suppose that they will suffer more welfare loss from negligence and as a result of their child dying than the leg injury. Then the intuitive thought that Anderson has is that society doesn't owe her compensation in terms of ensuring that she is helping for her welfare loss, right? Maybe they do owe her compensation in terms of some basic mental health treatment, right? But it doesn't mean that we should get her back to her previous state of welfare before the accident. But it definitely does owe her healthcare for her leg injury, according to Anderson. So the idea here is that there are certain goods, and here the good being that welfare, that is guaranteed to all citizens, right? And it's not about the minimum level of welfare resources. So the question for egalitarian theory is, what kinds of goods should egalitarians be concerned with ensuring a basic minimum level of, right? Not about how we can ensure equality of opportunity of welfare, or a certain initial set of equality of resources, and then allow the market to then play its role after that initial equality of resources has been achieved, right? So Anderson's argument is that egalitarianism cannot answer this question because the focus is on precisely equality of welfare, equality of opportunity of welfare, or equality of resources, then taking into account choice. And the second sort of criteria Desiderata she notes is that now the seatbelt argument might be true, right? But it is a pretty small overall limitation of one's liberty, right? That to wear a seatbelt is of course compatible with your self-respect because it is a pretty overall small limitation of your liberty. Just like in the thought is that mandatory social insurance, on the other hand, is a much more significant, much more widespread limitation of your liberty. Right? So the justification should be that the justification should be stronger than that the state knows better where one's interests lie, right? And the thought would be that what kind of justification here might suffice in terms of thinking about what would be good enough to show that these kinds of policies might be desirable, right? Now, one way of thinking about these cases, is to also say that is in the mask case, right? So the mask case is probably closer to the seatbelt case, right? In the end, while people do find it an inconvenience, overall, these types of policies are pretty small limitation of one's liberty, right? But then the justification for when other kinds of liberties are being restrained, right? Perhaps in this analogy, we can also compare it to general lockdown rules such as circuit breaker, for example, right? The justification for mask wearing versus circuit breaker might be the same, right? In that it's public health concerns, but perhaps the thought might be that the level of evidentiary certainty, right, and the significance, right, should be pretty high or higher in one than the other. So another problem is that those people who are being compensated for bad good luck by the government are likely to be insulted. So let's sort of look at this idea a bit more carefully. Anderson puts it very nicely, so I won't try to sort of summarize it, but here what she writes: imagines a letter that you get from the government explaining why you have certain kinds of compensation, right? And so she writes, to the disabled, your defective native endowments or your current disabilities make your life less worth living than the lives of normal people, right? So the idea here is that as the luck egalitarian thinks, right, there's certain sort of genetic endowments which will make it such that they cannot get equality of welfare opportunity than others, so we have to sort of compensate them for this kind of misfortune, right, as it says here, right? Misfortune, and so they have to have extra resources to make the worth of living your life good enough, right? That's the idea, right? And to those people who made sort of various choices, or they didn't have certain sort of cognitive talents or abilities, right? Their talents are too meager to command much market value, so therefore others will make it up to them, right? So this idea precisely that luck egalitarianism has been talking about, which we have been sort of talking about, right? This idea of compensation, right? Compensating for one's various choices in the mandatory social insurance scheme, right? making sure that people sign up so that they don't have certain bad effects. And in this case, right, those people who have bad good luck, we compensate them for bad good luck, right? But this compensation, right, as sort of Anderson sort of writes out here, shows here, it can be pretty seemingly insulting and demeaning. Right, so the idea is exactly as I mentioned, really, that compensation is marking out the disabled or those whose talents are not recognized by the state as inferior and is potentially insulting. Now, this is not necessarily a problem, at least with respect to talents, right? The fact that the society at wide thinks that certain talents and abilities are not maybe require some kind of compensation, right? That's not necessarily a bad thing per se, right? Because people can sort of generally, maybe we think that that is permissible at least, right? It might not be the best thing, but at least people can, in terms of social norms, have this idea. But here, the issue is really that the government, the state, is the one that's presumably endorsing this as the truth, right? So what is left to sort of like social norms, private disdain, right, as Anderson sort of puts it, is now the status of officially recognized truth, right? And when you do that, that is insulting because the state shouldn't have that kind of relationship with its citizens if it is to be an egalitarian state, right? That's the sort of intuition that Anderson is working on. Now, then you might say, perhaps, what if the government didn't write such an insulting letter, right? Maybe the government just needs to brush up on its communication skills, just like, arguably, right, in that Facebook post with Lee Hsien Loong, right? It's a matter of sort of communicating more clearly the rationale for CPF and explaining to people, right, what's wrong. But Anderson wants to sort of say that the problem is more deep-seated. Let's see why. Right? The idea is that, according to her, is that the people who are disadvantaged, they have a claim to the resources and have a claim to compensation, in other words, because they are inferior to others in some sense. And so she tries she draws this distinction, pretty intuitive one, I hope to show, between compassion and pity. Right? So compassion is this awareness that the person that you are feeling compassion for is suffering. But pity is a kind of there's typically a mix with condescension, right? Because it's the idea that it's relative, right? That this person is worse off than me, right? That I am better off than that other person, right? I pity that person because that person is in a bad state or a worse state than me. So compassion seeks to alleviate suffering but not equalize it, right? Whereas pity, right, sees that someone else is worse off and then we compensate them for being worse off. So Luck egalitarianism is based on pity, according to Anderson, right? Because there's this idea that people who have benefited from either genetic endowments or circumstances of life or choosing certain talents or having certain cognitive abilities, right? They are superior to those who are the objects of their compassion. So that's why egalitarianism is based on pity. And you can see this kind of thought also in many charitable sort of publicity for charitable events, right? So here, in this very famous song, I hope that some of you would know it, right? Do they know it's Christmas time at all, right? Apologies for my bad singing, right? That's just sort of remind you of the song, right? And here he says, well, tonight, thank God it's them instead of you, right? And this idea here is that we are doing charity because they are pitiful, right? The people in this case in Africa are pitiful because, and is Africa because it's stated here clearly, and it was written during a time where there was a lot of concern about global poverty in Africa, and this was one of the sort of fundraising songs. And then this lyric here, I think, sort of illustrates this idea of how this idea that we should compensate people in Africa because we have it much better than them, and that is a form of pity, not a form of compassion, right? At least if we interpret it in that way. So what about the disadvantage then? What about the flip side of pity? What is the sort of flip side of the emotion? Anderson argues that it is envy, right? Those who have less want what others have, right? And we can see this most clearly in thinking about Dorkin, right? Who argues that equality of resources, one way of thinking about it is through an envy-free allocation. And she argues that it's hard to think about that we can generate these obligations based on this idea of envy or these kinds of desires. One question worth thinking about is why that is the case. Now, as to perhaps why that is the case, one of the possible thoughts might be that it is not clear why I have a claim, right? I can hold you to account to give me compensation based on my feelings of envy, right? That doesn't seem intuitively to be the kind of thing that I owe you, right? As a matter of justice, right? So there's this thought running through, which we will look more carefully at in class, that justice requires certain kinds of legitimate or appropriate demands. Like egalitarianism doesn't really show us why these are legitimate demands. So intermediate conclusion we come to, Anderson argues that like egalitarianism fails to show equal respect because it can only provide paternalistic reasons for compensation, as we've discussed, and it also fails to show equal concern because it bases equalization on pity. Thank you for listening to this video. Hopefully it was interesting enough and you enjoyed some of my singing unexpectedly, and I will see you in the next video for the last set of discussion on Anderson's objection to Locke egalitarianism. Thank you.